And welcome to our video lecture meeting for Political Science 103, Comparative Politics at Mesa College. Today we're going to be talking about variation in how democracies function. We're going to be looking at what democracy means and how different democracies around the world practice their democratic institutions differently. Just to situate this lecture in the broad educational goal of the entire class, we have been discussing the possibility that we can learn about the social world by conducting scientific investigations that attempt to control for alternative explanations for change. And then I made a broad pitch that humans in their anarchical interactions face certain types of market failures because they can't trust each other, or because their incentives are structured in certain ways. And then made a second type of sales pitch that institutions, broadly speaking, states, mafias, companies, community groups, are all kind of built to create rules that change incentives and in this way solve or mitigate these market failures, like the collective action problem or the informational asymmetry of these things. What we've done so far is go through four major archetypes of institutions that are important for understanding political or economic or social outcomes. And for the rest of this class, we're going to dive more deeply into the most obviously political of those four, which is the state. So we're going to spend a little bit of time over the next three lectures talking about democracy and democratic practice. We'll talk about democratic backsliding towards authoritarianism. And then we will have a week in which we look at the purposes and reasons that autocracies might use democratic institutions somewhat cynically. So in each of these circumstances, we're asking whether or not a particular set of institutions or a particular set of rules is going to affect the extent to which we put up with a market failure. Broadly speaking, democratic institutions are intended to solve these market failures in ways that positively affect the lives of all of the people who live in the country. But of course, we have political actors, elites who have concentrated influence, who attempt to abuse these rules or change these rules in ways that give them back some form of structural social advantage. And where we're going to see this the most plainly is in 2 weeks when we look at autocratic practice and how institutions like free elections or the free press are sometimes abused by autocrats in order to reinstitute their own power. Okay, one last point before we move on from this slide. As it said in the email, there are two other YouTube videos that I normally show during this class. So when I reach those slides, I'll let you know that you should check out either the Hotelling's Principle video or the Duverger's Law video. And then I'll give, like a 3 or 4 second pause so that you have a minute to pause this video and watch the other one. And then when you come back, I'll talk a little bit about what was in that video and why it might be important to the class. Okay, so the goals of this lecture then are to see institutional choices as variables that we can measure, right? Not only whether we have a state, not only whether we have a democracy, but what type of democratic choices we make, what rules we set up about certain behaviors might be seen as variables. Sometimes these institutions are dependent variables. We might care why we ended up with certain choices. Why are some countries presidential systems? What explains the number of parties that exist in a democratic system? Why do we only have 2 parties in the United States, for example? Why do some countries have federalism while other countries are relatively nationalized? What brought us to these places? And then second, of course, we might ask the effect of these institutional choices as an independent variable. How does changing the rules of a democracy change policy outcomes? So on one hand, when we think about institutional choices as dependent variables, we're looking at the shape of market failures, we're looking at the shape of incentives or the distribution of incentives in a society and asking, how did these institutions get designed? Who advantages from these institutions? Who had control at the time that they were created? And then when we think about these institutions as an independent variable, since these rules have been implemented, what sorts of economic or political or social consequences do we see from that? How would the world be different if we changed our institutional rules in some way? Okay. We also want to be thinking about institutional choices as responses to interests and preferences. An example of this might be voter registration laws. We'll look at this in a little bit more detail in a few slides, but certain people have certain interests in restricting or expanding the franchise, giving voting rights or taking voting rights away from certain populations in the country, or in the alternative, making it costlier or easier for certain groups of people to vote or not vote. The structure of these incentives, we think, probably has something to do with the institutional choices we make. Who was in power, who had the rights to create the institution at the time, and what their interests were, probably broadly influential with respect to what institutions we end up with. And then lastly, as I've already discussed, I'd like us to start seeing institutions as responses to coordination problems or market failures. Which institutions are the most effective? And again, in order to answer this question, you'll have to adopt the perspective of a particular person living in this case, a democracy. What looks like an effective solution to a collective action failure, for example, looks different from the perspective of different people who have different interests in having that problem solved in different ways. Okay, so to kick off the conversation then from Strom et al., we have this idea that there is such a thing as a policy cycle that moves in several steps. If we start at what is kind of the beginning, well, I guess actually we're starting at the end. Sorry about that. So we have these stages in the policy cycle, and at each stage in the policy cycle, there are institutions that affect how outcomes and inputs in the policymaking process are put into play. So remember what a dependent variable means, right? What are we trying to explain if policy down here is our ultimate dependent variable? Right? If what we'd really like to know is why we end up with certain types of policies, why the speed limit is what it is, why the tax rate is what it is, we're going to want to think about how interests are aggregated in society and how election or selection laws change who is allowed to make policy in the first place, right? So we can see that there might be institutions at every link in this chain that will have an effect on policy through the mechanism on this slide. Then once policy is made, we worry about how people react to policy. Right? We're going through something of a change in American politics where the younger generation is thinking that the institutional rules are not working for it because the policies that it generates don't benefit that generation. So once we see what the policy is, we have certain interests, rules about social cooperation, who is allowed to communicate with one another. And some of those rules might be laws that restrict to whom you might communicate, but others of them might be social mores that tell you who you are and are not allowed to speak to without receiving some type of social disapproval from your circle. We have rules that maybe reward or disincentivize social groups for organizing. The structure of the media, how free are the media? Can lobbying groups donate lots and lots of money, or are they restricted in terms of how much they can donate to any particular political campaign? The upshot here is that people care about policy, and how they organize, how they aggregate their interests, decides what's sort of on the pre-election agenda. What are the power brokers in the community that we're talking about? If we're talking about a democracy, it's the elected officials. What are they going to be discussing? What needs are they going to need to address? This agenda is all set as we think about how individuals who experience policy outcomes are allowed to aggregate their interests and communicate. Once interests are aggregated, we might guess that rules about who votes for who and when they're allowed to vote have an impact on which people actually get elected and which parts of the public interest they emphasize and care about, right? Not only do most political candidates have differing opinions about how to handle a particular problem, they have differing opinions about which problems are the most important to maintain the health of the country or the health of whatever demographic it is that that particular elected official serves. Then we have rules. Once we've elected people, we have rules that discuss the responsibilities of each role in government. What are the people we elected allowed to do? And again, you might guess that different distributions of powers and responsibilities among the different elected officials will generate different types of policy. For example, very strong presidents that are capable of pushing legislation through without a lot of interference from the legislature might enact different suites of policies than countries that are relatively similar, but where the legislature has a lot of power. Okay, so what is politics? We've kind of avoided talking about this up to this point in the semester because it's a little bit of a fraught question and sometimes kind of boring, but it's interesting the way that Strom defines it because it helps set out a limitation for what sorts of outcomes we're talking about here. And according to Strom and his co-authors, politics refers to public and authoritative decisions. Now, among these public and authoritative decisions, there are certain types of policies, certain policy goals that Strom and his co-authors see as being legitimate. Take just a second to brainstorm what types of decisions Strom and his co-authors think politics and public authority can be used to legitimately do. Okay, so the first political project that is seen as legitimate by Strom and his co-authors is the act of building a nation. Right? Most states are interested in building a nation. Notice the difference here. There's a distinction being drawn between a nation and a state. These are two concepts that you want to keep distinct. A state is typically seen as a geographically bounded area controlled by a single federal government. There are other definitions of state that become a little bit more problematic when we talk about places where control is mixed, but another definition of state that's pretty functional is the territory over which any particular violent actor has a monopoly on the use of violence. Now, what we determine to be a monopoly on the legitimate use of violence might get a little bit squishy at certain times, right? Certainly there are places in the United States where the federal government does not have a monopoly on the use of violence. And there are probably some people who see alternative violence-producing institutions to be legitimate in some way. So maybe the United States is not a perfect state, and maybe there is no perfect state according to this definition, but you can see how on a sliding scale, the states of developed Asia, the states of Western Europe, the states of North America are probably pretty close to that definition of a state, whereas many African and Central Asian nations where control is deeply fractured and loyalties are deeply fractured are less of an archetypal definition of a state. A nation, on the other hand, is a type of imagined community. This is a group of individuals who feel some sort of social kinship and common destiny. And notice that this is not exclusive, right? In a very trivial way, you can feel both American and Irish, or you could feel both like an African American and an American. So there's, in some ways, you can probably belong to more than one nation. But the argument that Strom is making here is that a state should attempt to build a nation that includes everyone that lives in the state. Some sort of inclusive civic nationhood is a legitimate way to use public authority. Okay, so what are the elements of a nation then? If this is an imagined community, what sorts of characteristics bind people together? Strom and his co-authors list 4. One is ethnicity. Ethnicity is the belief that people have some sort of common biological ancestors. There have been many interesting genetic studies that attempt to demonstrate that there is such a thing as a biological ethnic community, and they almost all end up failing and demonstrating, in fact, that our concepts of ethnicity and race are extremely socially constructed. We pick certain characteristics that we mark as biological, and we reject other characteristics as somehow socially motivated and don't count them in our ethnic or racial categories. And in fact, many of those things are either genetic or social, and so our definitions of race and ethnicity are not nonfiction, I guess. They're fictional. A second potential element of nationhood is language. If we all read the same newspapers and we're capable of reading great works of literature by the same novelists, then we will have some sort of artistic or political or socially similar experience that binds us together and makes us feel like a common political or social body. Religion, sort of the same reason. We have common values or traditions. Anyone who belongs to our nation has experienced those values and traditions and therefore are in some way like us. whereas people who belong to other religions are in some way unlike us. And then lastly, it's possible to think about the state to which we belong as being an element of our nationhood, right? Again, in the same way that language or religion endows us with common experience, belonging to the same state, having the same institution wield power over us, causes us to experience common political outcomes. And as a result of this, we see each other as being somehow similar. Okay, some examples of states and nations. Japan is a nation state, right? By this definition, there are some states like Japan that are pretty much synonymous with their nations. There are very few people who live in Japan permanently, have Japanese citizenship, who are not also somehow ethnically or racially Japanese, who don't speak Japanese, participate in some form of Buddhism or Shintoism, that don't share some sort of belief that they have an ethnic or racial community that is Japanese. Spain might be a slightly different question, right? Most Spanish people probably feel as though they are nationally Spanish and politically Spanish. They all probably agree that the state of Spain has some sort of dominion over them if they're Spanish citizens. But there are a handful of people in Spain, the Basques and the Catalans in particular, who feel as though their ethnic traditions and their linguistic traditions endow them with a separate nationhood. And we've seen, and we'll discuss in greater detail later in this lecture, that this appeal to separate nationhood has been the cause of separatist movements and violence. It has affected the way that Spain has delineated its public policy. It's created federalist systems that provide certain rights to Spanish regions, especially the Basque region and the Catalan region, that affect how public policy happens and how people experience politics and economic and social life. The United States is typically seen as a state that is seeking a nation. We can be pretty cynical about how well the United States has done in assimilating or welcoming all of its migrant communities or people who have had a history of oppression. But when you look actually at how well people assimilate in the United States in terms of the incomes of the second and third generation, the fluency of the second and third generation in English, the United States is actually a fairly successful integrator of immigrants, as are most sort of English-speaking, well-developed former British Commonwealth countries. There are complaints you can make about Canada and Australia, but for the most part, these countries do a much better job integrating and welcoming immigrants than, say, the developed nations of East Asia, like South Korea or Japan, or similarly well-developed countries in Western Europe. Major contrast here, then, is Nigeria. Nigeria is a multinational state. Many people in Nigeria see themselves as belonging first and foremost to their major ethnic group, maybe second to a religious group. There's quite a bit of religious tension in Nigeria. And then lastly, they see themselves as being Nigerians. And so the state of Nigeria has not been very successful, maybe it hasn't tried hard enough, to make itself into a state that has a nation. So because these states include a number of nations, themselves often split by colonialism, right? I mean, Nigeria is a country that was created out of whole cloth using colonial borders, which is a substantially different project than how we created France or Spain, right? These are places that consolidated around single national identities. So we've sort of created a lot of states in Africa and the Middle East and in Central Asia where there are many nations that have been grouped together in ways that make this project of nation building through the state somewhat more difficult. Okay, so this has been sort of our rundown of building a nation as a legitimate use of public authoritative decision-making power. A second way that Strom and his co-authors argue a state can wield its public and authoritative decision-making legitimately is by fostering economic development. One example that the editors share is the relationship between education and wealth. Let's take 1 second here to look at this graph, right? What we see is a pretty strong correlation between education and wealth. It's somewhat curvilinear. It looks like at some point your annual years of school start to top out in terms of how much money you're likely to make. What is the problem with presuming causation here? Okay, so hopefully you thought immediately of the two things we should always think of when we see a correlation. The first is that it's plausible. Right? We're being told, right, that the causal arrow here points from average years of schooling to gross income. The more schooling you get, the more income that you generate. Of course, it's possible, plausible even, that the relationship is reversed. We spend more time in school because we make so much money as adults that we can afford to extend our childhood or our training period or a part of our life that gives us some sort of intrinsic joy. I'm sure you're all sitting at home listening to me drone on in this lecture and laughing to yourself about how intrinsically joyful college is. But it's plausible that there is some sort of reverse causation happening here. The second thing you should always wonder about, of course, is whether this causation or this relationship is spurious. Whether there is no causal effect of schooling on income or income on schooling, but that in fact there is some third variable that makes both things substantially more likely. So perhaps there's some sort of institutional explanation where we have a certain type of rule of law. People's property is secure enough that they go to work, and they also invest in building up their human capital in some way because it makes more sense for them to do so. And so, it's really about having rule of law in place first, and then you see both of these things emerge. Okay, so if we assume, however, that this relationship is causal, that the number of years you spend in school does increase your earning potential, and therefore the amount of taxes that you can pay into the social system, and therefore the amount of money that you can spend on other products that other people in your country make, Strom et al. Argue that spending money on education is a legitimate use of public and authoritative decision-making power. You can put a gun to the heads of citizens and take their money and spend it on public education because we're developing the economy. We're making everyone richer, and this, you'll notice, solves a collective action problem. People might want to provide money to public schooling but refuse in a system where there's no public authority being used to take this money and redistribute it. But if you do have that public authority and that authority is used to create schools, then everyone ends up richer and everyone is better off. In addition to a range of issues that create growth, states might also have to manage problems that arise from growth. For example, most capitalist systems struggle with growing inequality. How might a state engage in redistribution such that the opportunity structure is equal? That everyone who is born in a particular state has some sort of roughly equal opportunity to a good future. How do we manage environmental damage, right? As we become substantially more productive, we consume more resources, and as a result, we're more likely to damage the environment, which is, of course, not just some World Wildlife Federation hippie shit. This is actually the stock of material that we use, the capital account that we draw from when we build our economy. So sustainably managing this is part of economic development, Strom and his co-authors argue. And then lastly, we might care about fair market management. How do we make sure that everyone in the country has fair access to and protection from market institutions? Okay, so after we consider fostering economic development, a third way that we might legitimately use public and authoritative decision-making power is to protect human rights. We promote social policies that improve welfare and human capital, and as a result, we protect some group of human rights that we see as being instrumental or natural in some way. The provision of security is another way that a state can behave legitimately that's both internal and external, so both policing and providing an army. And then lastly, social justice and welfare, sort of a broad catch-all policy, especially if democratic bodies politic vote for it. Strom and his co-authors argue, we should consider some forms of social engineering that provide better justice and welfare systems to be legitimate. We as a community should be able to vote for or choose representatives that provide us with these sorts of benefits. Okay, so if these are the 5 broad categories of policy building in which states can legitimately engage, what sorts of things do states get wrong? What are illegitimate uses of state power? Strom and his co-authors list 4. First, the destruction of natural communities. What they mean here is that pre-existing nations should be allowed to continue to express themselves as nations. One of the ways in which the United States in its early days went about building nationhood was to do things like commit genocide against Native Americans or strip African slaves of their traditional names and provide them with English names and punish them for using any of their tribal religions or their old religions and force them to become Christian. These are very obvious examples of the destruction of natural communities, which Strom and his co-authors argue are illegitimate uses of public authority. So when we build our nations, there has to be some sense that that nation-building project is benign, that people are choosing to buy into their American, for example, identity over the top of their ethnic or religious identity because the state and its civic nation has welcomed them in some way and provided them with some sort of resources that their ethnic identities could not. Violating human rights, bad. Overregulation and inefficiencies. So notice already, by staking out this claim that it's possible for a state to overregulate, Strom et al. Make an argument that there's some amount of economic regulation that might be considered immoral. But you could guess that it's not very easy to get people to agree on what sorts of policies constitute overregulation or inefficiency to the point that it reaches immorality, right? Your sort of libertarians and progressives in the United States, for example, would disagree about these things pretty substantially. And then lastly, exploitation and unfair use of force. This is sort of the flip side of the coin to the broad catch-all category of social justice and welfare. The state can't arbitrarily discriminate against certain groups of people. It can't use its force to punish people when they don't know if those people are guilty. These sorts of abuses of the state's coercive power are seen as illegitimate. Okay, so we need some way now to understand how states pursue these purposes, when they overreach, and what sorts of policy outcomes they generate. And in order to do that, we can go back kind of to our old chart of comparative politics, or the comparative methods, right? So one possibility here is that policy outcomes are dependent variable, are influenced by institutions or the rules about how people interact with the state or how the branches of the state interact with one another. And we can divide these institutions into three categories that roughly correlate with the stages of the policy cycle, right? So we might care about which interest aggregators are legal or which interest aggregators exist in a particular society. We might care about what electoral rules there are, and we might care about whether there are separation of powers, or I guess I should say, since there are always some form of separation of powers, what that separation of powers looks like. Do we have a strong president or a strong legislature, or etc.? One way that we might think about dividing these institutions out, and in particular here we're probably thinking about the separation of powers, although you can imagine that this discussion will apply to interest aggregation as well, is the broad distinction between what we call majoritarian and consociational democracy. Consociational democracy is a concept that was sort of created and laid out theoretically by a former professor at UCSD named Aaron Lepart. Lepart argued that there are some forms of democratic institutions that allow a majority to have its way, and other forms of democratic institutions that encourage deal-making between natural constituencies within the democracy. So the distinction that we're after here is how much power do we give the majority? And there are sort of moral reasons or theoretical reasons that we might argue either way is better. We want to be thinking about or sensitive to the fact that the core of democratic practice is letting voters have their way, right? At some point we need to respect election, and too much minority power starts to frustrate a democracy. But at the same time, majorities, especially stable majorities, especially small stable majorities, have this nasty tendency to strip rights from people that disagree with them to make sure that they remain in power for a very long time. So in order to decide, thinking about Strom et al.'s moral state as our preferred outcome, we need to think about what sorts of state institutions, what kinds of state powers, what kinds of interest aggregation laws protect minority rights, allow them to have a voice in the political process, a potent voice in the political process, that is not a complete block on the progress that the majority craves. So a handful of majoritarian institutions here. Here are constitutional constraints against majoritarian rule in the United States. These are not checks against majorities. This is the exact opposite. These are the reasons that we think the United States is a majoritarian party, right? We vest power in one party per branch. Only one party can be in charge of each branch of government at the same time, and so the extent to which the minority party can disrupt the operation of that branch is extremely limited. Second, the minority party in the United States has the right in any branch to object, but doesn't control agenda setting or the ultimate legislative process, with a handful of exceptions, right? The filibuster in the Senate, and to some extent the way that the Senate is set up as a counter-majoritarian break using the Electoral College. Third, there are some sorts of constitutional constraints on majoritarian practice. So we think, for example, that it should be the case that the bare majority in the House of Representatives should be able to pass rules through that body, but we don't think it should be possible to amend the Constitution without the buy-in of 3/4 of the population or 3/4 of the demographic groups in the population, depending upon which route we're taking here. The benefits of majoritarian governance tend to be seen as the efficiency of governance, how quickly we can pass rules. So let's take a look here now at a concept of nested rules that helps explain how majoritarian regimes work and what different types of rules majorities have power over. Okay, so we have these nested rules, right? We can think about every rule that gets passed in a society, every law that gets passed by a state, as existing at one of these levels. At the lowest level, the most day-to-day level, are operational rules, rules about how we manage resources day to day. What is the speed limit? What are the tax rates? Do we provide minority-owned businesses with some sort of leg up? How much money goes into the police? All of these sorts of things have to do with how the government carries out its direct responsibilities, its direct moral obligations to exercise its public authority in a legitimate way. One set of rules more abstract than that are electoral or policy rules, right? How do we switch new people into defined roles? When do we elect them? Who gets to vote? How does policy change? Right? So these are the sorts of rules that affect who is allowed to vote, and to some extent, who, once they are in power, is allowed to vote to change policy. Then we have institutional rules. This is your sort of separation of powers level. Who gets what powers? What policies is each office holder allowed to make? And then lastly, and most abstractly, what are the rules about changing the rules? How is the Constitution written? If we want to change our institutional rules or our electoral rules, how do we go about changing them? And so what we think is that in a majoritarian system, there's a really strong majoritarian control over operational rules. There's very little that the Democrats can do in a minority to stop the Republicans from creating new operational rules. There's a little bit more that the minorities can do about changing electoral policy or policy rules. Again, the power is still, the ball is not in the court of the minority, but it's a little bit easier in most states in the United States, and in most cases of majoritarian rule, it's a little bit easier for the minority to object or block the attempts of the majority to, say, gerrymander or change the rules for who is allowed to vote in ways that benefit their political outcomes. And moving on up the chain, we see that there are counter-majority checks in the institutional rules, right? Changing rules about who gets what powers are sort of counter-majoritarian in the United States. The Senate is, a very major counter-majoritarian check. And then lastly, there's a lot of blocks on how well or how easily the majority can change constitutional rule. In fact, at this stage of the game, you need a lot of buy-in from a number of minorities. Okay. So let's take a look then at the flip side, right? What does a consociational regime look like? I don't know why that's stuck up there. Oh, sweet, there we go. Okay, so one hallmark of consociational democracies is when we have mutual vetoes, when it's possible for small minority groups to block legislation, and every minority group or every constituency or demographic in the country is endowed with some similar veto right. Second, we look toward the building of grand coalitions. Maybe we need supermajorities to pass legislation out of our House of Representatives or out of our legislative body. And so because we have empowered minorities and because we have the requirement of supermajority, we end up with grand coalitions that cut across demographic groups. We also look to proportional representation. We'll talk about proportional representation and how that is distinct from first past the post electoral systems in a few slides. But this is a system of voting aggregation that gives minorities broadly more rights, allows them to elect more legislators who can play as spoilers in the federal system. We also look at federalism. We're interested then in delineating or devolving certain powers, particularly over social policy. We'll talk about this in greater detail later as well. To smaller groups of people, we allow minorities to create some of their own social policy in the places where they tend to live. And the criticism of consociational democracy is that it tends to sacrifice efficiency. Building all of these grand coalitions using proportional representation, attempting to enact real change on social policy when your regional governments can block some of your social engineering is all really quite the pain in the butt, and things move very slowly. One example of an extremely consociationalist country that has a lot of problems getting anything done is Belgium. I think it's probably been 4 or 5 years since Belgium has even had a functioning government. The regions of Belgium are governing themselves, and no federal laws have changed in Belgium for more or less half a decade because there is such gridlock created by the consociational nature of the democracy. Okay, so now we can take a look at these sorts of broad independent variables and imagine how differences in how majoritarian or consociational each country is might have effects on policy outcomes. Now let's start to roll through these in a little bit more detail. We'll start with interest aggregation and how interest aggregation or rules about interest aggregation might affect policy outcomes. So the first step here is that we examine how interests are aggregated in a society. Let's take one example of a market in which we have interests. We might think about agricultural policy as primarily being about farmers, right? Food laws or these agricultural laws have a lot to do with whether farmers succeed or fail, what sorts of farms are able to produce, etc., etc. But of course, governments face pressure from food consumers who want food to be cheaper and safer at the same time. They face pressure from environmentalists who want the practices of the farmers to be sustainable. And they face pressure from bankers that participate in the agricultural sector and equipment producers who build capital for the agricultural sector and a number of others. Now, all policy markets have buyers and sellers and webs of complicated interests. So we might care about how these groups represent themselves, who gets heard and who gets drowned out. And in order to understand which groups are able to aggregate their interests most successfully into a particular society, we might look at what types of interest aggregation institutions exist in the country. So these are the basic types of networks that function to connect people to the power of their government. Let's take a look at each in turn. First, we have an exchange that occurs between a network and its clients. It can be characterized in one of two major ways. In programmatic or bottom-up relationships, citizens exchange things like donations and policy demands for a coherent platform and a slate of candidates that support some core set of planks within it. So in bottom-up or programmatic politics, we see that the party or the network is providing some sort of integrated platform that agrees with the candidates that they have nominated. And the citizens, in exchange for receiving this sort of information and this service, provide money and volunteer labor and policy demands and ultimately, hopefully for the party, votes. The result of this exchange is usually called programmatic politics. It produces programmatic policies that are available to all citizens. We'll talk about that in a second. It's easier to define this in terms of how it's not top-down or patronage. In a patron or top-down relationship, citizens exchange a sort of unwavering support for selective benefits, right? So notice the major difference here in terms of what the party or network provides is that we're not talking about policies or candidates that support them. We're talking about selective benefits or favoritism, access, preferential access that the citizen receives in order for providing lockstep political support or volunteer labor. The result here is a set of patronage goods that are only available to the members of one's network. So, in a patronage system, it is possible, and in fact even likely, that the politician who gets elected will attempt to pass policies such that only his or her constituents are capable of accessing those benefits, right? We want to direct all of our money or public resources to the people that elected me, and we will cut everyone else out of the benefits of the state. This is different than programmatic politics, right? I think that there's enough corruption in the United States and in other Western countries that we can be a little bit cynical about whether it's entirely a programmatic system. But for example, voting for a person who loses the presidential election does not, or the gubernatorial election, probably more relevant here, voting for the losing governor doesn't get you cut out of your welfare benefits. It's not like you're no longer allowed to apply for unemployment benefits if you voted for the Republican and the Democrat was elected. We set out policies that are intended to benefit everyone who lives in the country. And to the extent that you can characterize a particular policy as being intended to cut out a certain group of people based upon how they vote, then you can argue that that policy is to some extent patronage politics, right? And there are some Republicans or conservatives in the United States who make this argument about welfare policy in general. They argue that the Democrats are the party of the poor. I'm actually not sure how well supported that is, but they argue that the Democrats are the party of the poor. And so the Democrats provide lots of social services and welfare opportunities to poor people, knowing that those poor people are always going to vote Democrat. Now, of course, the rebuttal from the Democratic side is this is not patronage because any Republican who is or becomes poor can still freely avail themselves of these systems. Whereas if you were, for example, participating in an ethnically based patronage democracy in Africa, and you are Kikuyu and the Luo candidate wins, as a Kikuyu, you no longer have access to government programs, right? All of the infrastructure building is going to be pulled out of Kikuyu lands and put into Luo lands. Here, this table from Strom et al. Attempts to lay out a little bit of the independent variable stuff that I was talking about, right? States feature different combinations of interest aggregating institutions, and each of these examples, like in each state, we have different policy outputs, right? And we might imagine, hopefully we would do more than imagine, I guess we would test. We could imagine tests for the intuition that different combinations of existence of interest aggregation leads to different policy outcomes. I sort of jumped the gun on this. These slides are a little bit out of order because we're going to go back to discussing each of these types of associational groups or interest aggregators here in a second. So we might lay this out then. We might lay out our causal argument in one of two ways. First, we might argue that each individual combination of interest aggregation groups leads to some policy outcome, right? So our independent variable in this case is the precise combination of interest aggregation that exists in each country, and the interaction between these different types of interest aggregators that exist in each combo. Understanding that interaction is really important to understanding policy outcomes. We might also use as an independent variable the presence of a particular interest aggregator, and theorize that having that interest aggregator or not having that interest aggregator will have an isolated and important effect on policy outcomes. Okay, so I have no idea how those slides got ahead of the rest of these interest aggregation slides. But we've now talked about patron-client networks and a little bit about how you might think about the presence or existence of patron-client networks or programmatic politics as being a determinant of policy outcomes. In fact, let's brainstorm this for a second, right? You can pretty easily imagine that the shape of a welfare program will change in a place where people are just expected to vote for the party that represents their ethnicity than in a place where people can freely change parties between two ideological structures like the Republicans or the Democrats. In which country would you expect to get welfare benefits that apply to all people? Hopefully you answered that it's in the country where the parties, where any individual can switch between parties because there's no pressure for them from an ethnic group to participate in the ethnic politics, right? Where you have pressure from your social network to always vote for the party that represents your ethnicity, you're not going to leave that party no matter what it does. But if you live in a society where there's relatively little pressure to participate in a particular party that's tagged to you by your ethnicity or your religion or something, then the parties need to produce more programmatic politics in order to keep voters, right? There's no pressure to stay in your party. I don't know whether or not that's true. It seems reasonable to me. I would be surprised if it weren't true, but we would of course want to test this, right? We'd want to come up with some measure of the extent to which welfare policies in a particular country were programmatic or patronage, and then we would want to ask whether that amount of programmatic or patronage in the system is correlated with parties that are ethnically or religiously based, and then we could check and see if the hypothesis that they are in fact connected is true. Okay, so patron-client networks. We also care about the existence of associational groups. These are much more familiar. They're typically organized by an entrepreneur that sells membership for the benefit of promising to produce policies that benefit the interests of their members, right? So think for a second. Can you think of an associational group? Yes, that's exactly right. The NRA is what I was thinking too, or the American Association for Retired People, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or unions, or Greenpeace, or. These are all sorts of institutions that were created to profit some person or set of people that exchange money in the form of donations and membership fees for the promise to advocate for the policies that the voluntary members of these groups prefer. Militaries. Militaries are an interest aggregator. Militaries have stable policy preferences. They engage in a certain type of behavior in society, and because they engage in that behavior, they have certain types of material incentives that are kind of built into the organization. The difference, of course, right, and Strom and his co-authors worry about this, and so did the framers of the American Constitution, that the military has some ways to implement policy programs that other forms of interest aggregators listed here do not. Right? We've already talked about coups a little bit in this class. One of the ways that the military achieves its end is by engaging in a coup. If they don't like what the state is doing enough, if it violates the military's interests substantially enough, they engage in a coup. These sorts of politics have happened in the United States, right? Worcester versus Georgia was a Supreme Court case that gave sovereignty rights to Native American tribes. This happened during a time when Jackson was creating the policies that led to the Trail of Tears. He was attempting to evict Native American tribes from their land so that it could be repossessed by the United States. And he was attempting to do it without declaring war on these tribes. And so he was sued and told that this was outside the scope of his powers. Right? In fact, he had to treat these nations as though they were sovereign nations. These were not some sort of American citizens that could be policed. But he ignored the ruling. Jackson ignored the ruling and he mocked the court's inability to back up its decision with force. The military can decide how to use its powers and when not to, and maybe whether or not it ought to, right? So the military as an interest aggregation unit is extremely important. When and where do we see a military that is willing to dabble in politics, and what effect does that have on policies? You might expect slightly more militaristic regimes to emerge in places where we have interest aggregation institutions that give great latitude to the military to effect change. Now, of course, in no circumstance would we expect that a coup is part of the institutional structure of a state. It seems to be, by definition, a violation of that structure. But there are probably certain institutions, allocation of social power or legislative power or economic power to the military, that encourage coups. And in fact, we'll look a little bit later on at evidence about presidentialism versus parliamentarism and where we see the most coups. Lastly, we have political parties, right? We have competitive political parties, authoritarian political parties, and personalist political parties. The last two are a little bit more self-explanatory or maybe a little bit less complicated, at least in sort of an introduction to comparative politics sense. So we're going to spend most of our time talking about competitive parties. Competitive parties are a central feature and central to the operation of democratic states. A number of political scientists, including the authors of today's assignment, have demonstrated empirically that without parties fulfilling three important roles, democracy becomes functionally unworkable. It breaks down. What are those three roles? Here they are. The first thing that parties do is combine member interests and set an agenda, a political agenda that they're going to push and support with their candidates. They also sponsor and coordinate election strategy with voters. They decide who's going to run. They run get out the vote campaigns. And then they implement party discipline in service of the agenda once these candidates are in power. They threaten to take away the supportive apparatus, say, of the Tory party if you make a vote in Parliament that violates what the Tories want. Notice that these three purposes hit at every stage in the policy cycle that we discussed at the beginning of the lecture. Okay? Now, competitive political parties face certain challenges. Because competitive parties are so important, and because we're discussing democracy for such a short time, let's dig into one of those problems. Parties need to choose internally how to select candidates and their agenda, and they have two options in order to do this. The first option is party democracy. You delegate ultimate responsibility to the voters, which has the moral advantage of looking like a democracy. The second way that you might manage this problem is through some sort of party oligarchy. You selectively provide some number of people in the party with extra influence over who gets selected to run for office and over what sorts of policies the party prefers if it is elected. This allows for the demands of activists and donors to be met. Right, so the moral claim or the organizational claim here, one of the moral organizational claims for why party oligarchy is so important, is that if you alienate your donors and your party activists in favor of casual members of the party, your organizational apparatus will collapse. You'll be left without sufficient money or sufficient operating power in order to make the party run. Right, so we saw these sorts of objections play out in the primaries that led to the Clinton and Trump election, right? Very famously, many Democrats felt that something about Hillary Clinton's nomination was anti-democratic, that Bernie Sanders should have won the election. And all these talk about superdelegates, this, that, or the next thing. And Democratic Party grandees responded pretty forcefully to this. They said, listen, if we just go around letting everyone who caucuses with the Democrats when it's convenient to him run our party from the president's chair, we're very quickly going to alienate the very people who provide the money and ground operating capacity to run the party in the first place. It just so happens Bernie voters at this point in time were not volunteering in the Democratic Party. They weren't donating to the party. They weren't helping the party coordinate. They donated to and they volunteered for Bernie. So one lesson that you might take if you're a disaffected member of either political party in this case is that you can't just be involved in the campaigns of the candidate that you care for, especially if they are an outsider. You need to be involved in donating to and working for the party that you think is likelier to provide you with a slate of candidates and a platform of policies that you demand, because that's the way that you get leverage over the oligarchic demands for the party. Here's another reason that we might think that party oligarchies are important. And this is the first point at which I'll ask you to pause the lecture, go to the video about Hotelling's problem, watch through it, and then we will come back to this slide. Okay, welcome back. This video was obviously about businesses that operate in physical space. But there is also some truth to the idea that the analogy of Hotelling's problem applies to organizations that are looking to meet some form of moral or normative or social need of their constituents and need to compete for ideological space rather than physical space. And so you can imagine, right, the often repeated canard that Republicans and Democrats are very little different on the policies that they offer in most campaign years, that they're both somehow the party of the elite or the party of the banks or these sorts of things. Hotelling's law or Hotelling's problem would tell you that that's not only true, that it's expected. Right? It would be very difficult for Democrats to win an election by moving further left because they would simply lose half of the people in the space they left open between themselves and the Republicans in the first place. The most winning strategy that the Democrats or the Republicans could possibly engage in is to stand back to back with each other and stare their respective directions over the constituents that are now forced to vote for them. Now you'll notice that occasionally, if we're taking American politics as an example, occasionally the people who live really far down the beach from the ice cream stands revolt, and they attempt to force somehow the ice cream stand to move closer to them. But in those cases, the party often loses. Right? The business often loses a lot of its customers when it does this. So here's another set of pressures for oligarchic parties. Right? Most people come into political science classes hopeful and wide-eyed and thinking that what we ought to do is design parties that are internally democratic because that's the morality that we should support. But there are at least two reasons to think that internally democratic parties are weaker. They're more likely to lose. The first is Hotelling's problem, that if you move your policy too far away from the center of gravity of the rest of your opponents, you are likely to lose voters. And so if you respond to the extremes of your party by shifting left or right, you lose voters and you lose the election. And second, you may lose the people who have invested in building the party apparatus in the first place, and it would be very difficult to rebuild a party without those sorts of people. Just ask the Republicans how hard it is to run without the centrist Republicans that nominated people like John McCain and Mitt Romney, who have left the Republican Party in droves. Much, much more difficult to organize a ground game for the Republicans. And I would suggest to you that the reason that we saw a blue wave in the last midterm election was about as much due to the organizational losses that the Republican Party faced as it replaced Trump-sympathetic voters into positions that were held by longtime Republican activists, as it was a change in sentiment, a real change in sentiment of the people. Okay, authoritarian political parties, relatively easy to imagine. You have top-down management of the party. They distribute the spoils from participation in the political system to voters in ways that help prop up the party. They reward them for votes. They reward them for organizing activity. This is an extreme version of an oligarchic party. In contrast to competitive parties where voters have resources, even if they are disaggregated, in authoritarian systems, control of the state gives the party resources to distribute to voters, right? So authoritarian parties are not just oligarchic parties. They are parties that control the state. And so the sorts of behaviors you see here are, for example, state television. Right? An authoritarian party in an authoritarian state will use state media to spread its message, and that gives it a very direct access to the people that a competitive party in an authoritarian system lacks. There are two types of authoritarian parties that Strom and his co-authors describe. One is an exclusive governing party. This is totalitarian. They ban other parties. They ban other forms of civic engagement. Oftentimes, the only way that you can join a book club or a knitting club or a bowling club is to join the Communist Party's book club or knitting club or bowling club, and the book club probably gets boring because you read Mao 17 times. Others are more inclusive. They allow other parties, they allow civil society, and they're tolerated, and they use them oftentimes as information gathering tools, and we're going to dig quite a bit into this when we read Shots and Blades in a couple of weeks. Lastly, we have personalist parties. These are sort of quirky. They're falling out of style right now. They're also pretty intuitive. These are figurehead regimes like those run by Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and Saddam Hussein in Iraq. The party is mostly about one person. I mean, it's not really about one person. There are definitely people in the military and the business community who have influence over what Gaddafi or Saddam or Bashar al-Assad do or say. But in general, the party isn't just run for the benefit of some sort of continuing existing organizational elite, like the Communist Party in China, for example, does. In this case, it's run for the benefit of a single person or his, almost always his, family. Okay, so having dealt with interest aggregation rules, this is where I should have put those slides, where I set out the, where did those slides go? This is where I should have put these slides. We might think about the combination of different networks that exist in each country and posit that this is an independent variable that is going to affect policy outcomes. Places that have authoritarian parties but no competitive parties and a moderate influence of patron-client networks are going to look very different than places that have few patron-client networks, lots of competition in the parties, and a complete absence of an authoritarian party, right? Especially we might think of places that have military force interest aggregators that are high in their influence or moderate in their influence are going to look substantially different than countries where the influence of the military over domestic politics is relatively low. So having covered now interest aggregation, we'll move on to thinking about electoral rules. Okay. A couple of variations in electoral. So electoral rules, the number of variations, like the number of variations in interest aggregators, frankly, the number of variations in electoral rules can vary substantially and infinitely, right? We're going to talk about one that is particularly important, which is the distinction between first past the post representation and proportional representation. First past the post election rules provide one winning candidate for every geographic unit. So the House of Representatives in the United States is a first past the post system. Every district elects one representative. This is different from proportional representation, where each geographic unit elects multiple candidates that represent the distribution of the votes in the unit. Let's take a look at an example. Say you have a situation in which the population is 75% for the red party and 25% for the blue party, and they are distributed evenly across space. If these people get to elect a single representative from each district, each square Wyoming-shaped district, what will the result be? What will Congress look like? All right, probably we have a red rep for every district, right? We have a completely red legislator. In contrast, if we make this whole thing a district, and they get to elect the 4 most popular representatives, then the representatives going to Congress from this district will look like what? Now we have 3 reds and a blue. And of course, if we have many, many of these larger geographic units all over the country, and in some places the blues outnumber the reds, this system of first past the post gives very little reward or political voice to the blue dots that are left over, whereas here those blue dots get some type of voice. Given this obvious difference, it's really not hard to see why electoral rules might influence policy output, right? Having a first past the post system will give you a more, potentially give you a more radicalized legislative body, whereas having a PR system gives you a more centrist policy body. It's also true, though, that we can think about how electoral rules change interest aggregation. If electoral rules influence who gets elected, what sorts of people are competitive, then we might suspect that these electoral rules will generate different, for example, party structures. And this is exactly what Duverger's law predicts. A state will have a number of parties that is equal to the number of representatives from the lower district plus 1. So now I would like you to, actually I'm not going to have you pause the video. I'm going to stop recording the lecture here. I'm going to post a second video that you can start watching after you finish watching the Duverger's law video, and I will see you over in that video in just a few minutes.